Barron Trump's controversial request was seen as absurd, but the room froze the moment Melania appeared. The morning sun shone through the windows of a financial bank in Pinecrest in downtown San Diego. It was a place where every surface sparkled and the air was charged with the sound of efficiency. The impeccably dressed staff chatted professionally as customers came and went with purpose. Just before 10 a.m., the golden doors opened. A tall, well-dressed young man in a white polo shirt and khaki pants walked in. His polished shoes echoed on the marble floor as he strode confidently toward the counter. His hair was perfectly combed, his posture was erect, and his presence commanded attention, though not in the way one expected. Barron Trump, now a young adult, approached the counter with a smile. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from years in the spotlight, but without pretense. When he reached the counter, he read the name of the clerk in front of him. Sandra H., good morning, she began politely, her voice firm and respectful. I would like to open a new account, please. Sandra barely looked up, her expression somewhere between disinterest and skepticism. Do you have an appointment? She asked. I don't, Barron admitted, keeping his smile. But I was told I could speak to someone about opening a new account. Sandra smiled cheekily, leaning her elbows on the counter. Her eyes scanned him for a moment, as if she were calculating whether he was worth it. Behind her, two other employees exchanged knowing glances, one of them muttering something that made the other laugh. Barron remained impassive, aware of the change in the atmosphere. Is there anyone available who can help me? He asked calmly. Sandra finally looked at him, her expression full of disdain. We're pretty busy today, she said softly. Maybe you should schedule a meeting next time. We're not here to, she paused, letting the sentence hang in the air. Barron pressed his lips together slightly. He reached into his inner shirt pocket and pulled out a folder. I have all the necessary documents here, he explained, his voice still polite but with a hint of firmness. It should only take a few minutes. Sandra looked at the folder before letting out a steady sigh. Look, he said, lowering his voice. This isn't the kind of place where you just walk in and expect immediate service. We serve a certain clientele. The presumption was clear, wrapped in a veneer of professionalism, but full of judgment. Barron, however, did not back down. I understand, he replied, his tone measured. But I believe this is exactly the kind of place I'm looking for. Sandra didn't budge. She gestured vaguely toward the exit. I think you might be more comfortable on another bench. Maybe somewhere more accommodating. But what happened next would ensure that everyone in that room would remember that day for a long time. The air in the bench seemed to grow heavier as Sandra's tone echoed through the silent room. Barron paused for a moment, his composure unwavering. His eyes swept over the other employees behind the counter, who were now laughing openly, apparently enjoying the scene. One of them, a young man with a name tag reading Kyle M., leaned over to Sandra and whispered something that made her smile. Sandra turned to Barron and shook her head, as if assessing him again. Listen, she said, her voice taking on a condescending tone. This isn't the kind of place where we deal with casual passing. Maybe you didn't read the sign correctly when you came in. Barron stepped back a little. Sorry, did I miss something? He asked, his voice still calm, but tinged with incredulity. Kyle, who had walked away, suddenly interjected. Yes, mate, he said, loud enough for the others to hear. This isn't one of those banks where you just show up and expect to be served. You have to, meet certain qualifications. Barron turned to Kyle, his expression neutral but his posture a little stiffer. I understand, he said, his voice taking on a firm tone. And what qualifications are those? Kyle stepped back, looking back in his chair with a smile. Let's just say, the type of people we typically see don't come in without an appointment. Sandra smiled, clearly pleased with her colleague's words. Exactly, we have a certain standard here, he added. It's nothing personal, of course. Barron took a deep breath, looking around the lobby. The other patrons were now watching the interaction. Their curiosity was palpable. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one intervened. Barron turned to Sandra, his tone firm but respectful. I understand you're busy, he said, but I don't think my request is unreasonable. If there's someone I can talk to, maybe a manager, I'd be happy to wait. Sandra smiled, and Kyle pulled away for a moment before regaining his composure. Our manager is unavailable, he said quickly, and honestly, we don't have time to explain our policies to everyone who walks through the door. Kyle smiled again, and this time, Barron's eyes reflected disappointment instead of anger. He slowly put the folder back into his shirt pocket. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath as he stood there, staring at Sandra and Kyle, as if committing their faces to memory. Thank you for your time, he finally said, his voice low but firm. Without another word, he turned and began walking toward the exit. But as soon as the glass doors began to close behind him, the atmosphere in the bank changed in a way no one could have predicted. The glass doors hadn't even fully closed behind Barron when a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of the bank. The vehicle was understated but undeniably expensive, its presence drawing curious glances from passers-by. From the passenger side, Melania Trump stepped out with a grace that immediately commanded attention. Dressed in a cream blouse and sunglasses, she moved with quiet authority. Her heels clicked firmly on the pavement as she made her way to the entrance, her posture regal and her expression calm but determined. Those near the windows straightened instinctively, their eyes widening as they recognized her. Inside, Sandra was already reminiscing about Barron's interaction with Kyle, chuckling softly as she mimicked his polite tone. "Can you believe he actually thought?" he began. But his words died in his throat as the doors opened again and Melania stepped into the lobby. The room fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and the sound of keyboards abruptly ceased. Heads turned in unison as Melania removed her glasses and scanned the room. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, as she spotted Barron standing just beyond the counter, facing her. "Barron," she called, her voice clear and composed, cutting through the silence. He turned, his expression softening slightly as he saw his mother approaching. "Mom," he replied, his tone measured but filled with relief. Melania reached his side in a few strides, placing a comforting hand on his arm before turning her attention back to the counter. Her gaze fell on Sandra, who now looked visibly uncomfortable, her earlier confidence crumbling under Melania's scrutiny. "Is there a problem here?" Melania asked, her voice calm but firm. The question wasn't directed at Barron. It was clearly for Sandra. Sandra swallowed hard, and her face tightened as she searched for an answer. "Oh, no, ma'am," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kyle, still sitting behind the counter, looked equally uncomfortable. He shifted nervously in his chair, avoiding Melania's gaze as he fiddled with a sheaf of papers. Melania did not raise her voice, but the weight of her presence was palpable. "I was under the impression that this bank prides itself on professionalism," she said, her words deliberate. "But from what I saw, that standard was not maintained for my son." Sandra opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it, clearly unsure of what to say. The other employees watched in startled silence, their previous arrogance now replaced by a mixture of shame and fear. Melania approached the counter, her expression unwavering. "You may not have recognized him," she continued, her tone darker now. "But that's no excuse for treating anyone, especially a potential customer, with disrespect." Sandra spread her hands, shaking a little as she tried to regain her composure. I didn't realize," she began, her voice cracking. "No," Melania interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You didn't bother to realize. And that's the problem." But what came next ensured that Sandra and Kyle would never forget this encounter or its aftermath. Silence on the bench was dissipating. Sandra's face had turned a shade of red, her previous arrogance replaced by visible shame. Kyle, who had been so quick to ridicule Barron moments before, now looked like he wanted to sink into his chair and disappear. Even the other employees, who had been giggling and whispering earlier, were frozen at their stations, their nervous eyes darting between Melania and her colleagues. Melania kept her gaze steady, her expression unwavering. "You represent this institution," she said, her words precise and cutting. "Your behavior reflects not only on you, but on the bank as a whole. If you can't offer basic courtesy and professionalism, perhaps you're in the wrong line of work." Sandra opened her mouth, but no words came out. Kyle shifted uncomfortably, looking around, but none of the other employees dared to intervene. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every second of silence felt like an eternity. "I'd like to speak to the manager," Melania continued, her tone calm but leaving no room for argument. "Now," Sandra hesitated, her hands trembling on the keyboard in front of her. "Ma'am, the manager isn't," she began, but Melania's stern look cut her off mid-sentence. "Then I suggest you find him," Melania said calmly. "I'm not leaving until this is resolved." Reluctantly, Sandra nodded and hurried toward a door marked manager. The other employees watched her leave, their faces a mix of shame and fear. Kyle, for his part, pretended to be busy with papers, though his shaking hands betrayed his nervousness. As they waited, Melania turned to Barron. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her demeanor changing in an instant from commanding to caring. Barron nodded, offering her a small smile. "I'm fine," he replied. "But thanks for coming." Melania gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before turning her attention to the manager's door. The other patrons in the lobby, who had watched the entire scene unfold, began to whisper among themselves. Some seemed sympathetic, others intrigued, but all seemed captivated by the silent drama unfolding before them. Minutes later, Sandra returned, followed by a middle-aged man in a red suit who looked frustrated but determined to resolve the situation. His name tag identified him as Michael L., branch manager. "Mrs. Trump," he began, extending a hand that Melania didn't shake. "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Please let us come to my office to discuss this." Melania didn't budge. "What needs to be discussed is the behavior of your employees," she said firmly. "My son came here to open an account and was met with ridicule and disrespect. Tell me, is this how you teach your employees to treat potential customers?" Michael's face turned red. "Of course not," he said, his voice raised. "This is unacceptable. I assure you that we will take immediate action." Melania raised an eyebrow. "Immediate action?" she repeated, her tone skeptical. "I hope it's more than empty promises." Michael nodded. "Absolutely. I'll take care of it personally. Please allow me to make this right." Melania studied him for a moment before finally nodding. "Good, because if I hear about this again, I'll make sure everyone involved is held accountable, including you." Michael swallowed, nodding again. "Understood." By the time the confrontation was over, the employees' faces were etched with shame and regret. They had underestimated Barron, judging him based on their own prejudices, and now they faced the consequences of their actions. But the lesson wasn't over yet. Melania had one last message to deliver before she left the bank. The room tensed as Melania turned her gaze to Sandra and Kyle, who now looked visibly shaken. Their earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by the realization that their actions were not only unprofessional, but that they were potentially jeopardizing their positions. Melania took a deliberate step toward the counter, her voice firm but gentle. "Respect is not something you selectively give based on appearance or status," he said, his words addressed to the entire room. "It's a reflection of your character, not the status of the person in front of you." Sandra's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the counter, and Kyle avoided eye contact completely. Melania's presence was magnetic, her words carrying the weight of experience and authority. The customers who had watched in silence now nodded in silent agreement, their expressions reflecting a mixture of admiration and approval. "You never know who's standing in front of you," Melania continued, her voice softening but no less powerful. "Whether it's my son or someone without a famous last name, every individual deserves to be treated with dignity." Barron, standing silently beside her, looked at his mother with a touch of pride. He was used to the scrutiny and assumptions that came with his family name, but his mother's defense in this moment reminded him of the values she had always instilled in him: respect, grace, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Michael, the branch manager, stepped forward, eager to diffuse the tension even further. "Mrs. Trump, please allow us to make this right," he said, his tone sincere. "We will make sure this never happens again. And, Mr. Trump, it would be an honor to help you open your account today." Melania gave him a pointed look, her expression softening a bit. "See what you do," she replied. Turning to Barron, she asked, "Would you like to proceed?" Barron hesitated, glancing briefly at Sandra and Kyle. They looked utterly defeated, their earlier confidence reduced to nothing. He then turned to his mother, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Yes," he said simply. As Michael personally escorted Barron to his office, Melania returned one last time to address the staff. "Let this be a lesson," she said, her voice echoing around the room. "Never underestimate someone based on your own assumptions. It's a mistake you don't want to repeat." With that, she followed Barron, leaving Sandra and Kyle in stunned silence. The other employees exchanged nervous glances, and customers began to whisper among themselves. The entire bank seemed to take a deep breath, the tension finally dissipating. But even with the doors to the manager's office closed, the weight of the lesson hung in the air. A reminder that respect and humility should never be optional. Inside the manager's office, the atmosphere was quieter but no less reflective. Barron sat across from Michael, who was meticulously reviewing the papers. His hands still shook slightly. Melania sat nearby, her composure unwavering as she watched the proceedings. Despite the earlier tension, his presence now felt less like a confrontation and more like a lesson being imparted. When Michael handed Barron the final document to sign, he hesitated for a moment. Looking at the manager, Barron's voice was calm but deliberate. I hope this is a learning experience for everyone, he said, because the way you treat people says more about you than it does about them. Michael nodded, his expression sincere. You're absolutely right, he said, and I deeply apologize for the way you were treated today. It won't happen again. Barron finished signing the document, then stood and held out his hand. Michael shook it, his grip firm, though it was clear he felt the weight of the moment. Melania offered a small nod of approval before leaving with her son. As they left the office, the lobby seemed transformed. The once arrogant staff now avoided eye contact, their posture stiff with embarrassment. The other customers who had witnessed the entire scene offered subtle nods and encouraging smiles as Barron and Melania walked toward the exit. Just before she left, Melania paused. She turned to the staff, her gaze sweeping the room. Today was about more than just a bill, she said. It was about integrity. Remember that the next time someone walks through these doors, without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out with Barron at her side. The glass doors closed behind them, leaving a bench full of employees and customers reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Outside, the black SUV waited, its driver ready to open the door for them. When Barron got in, he turned to his mother. You didn't have to do all this, he said with a small smile, though his tone carried a note of gratitude. Melania smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. It's not just about you, she said. It's about teaching people to be better for themselves and others. The SUV drove off, leaving the bank and its staff behind, but the impact of the encounter lingered long after it was gone. For Sandra and Kyle, it was a powerful reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the importance of treating every individual with respect, regardless of their appearance or assumptions about their worth. This story isn't just about Barron or Melania. It's about all of us. It's a reminder that our actions and words matter, especially when dealing with others. Judging someone based on their appearance or preconceived notions not only hurts them, but it also reveals our own flaws. The lesson here is simple. Treat everyone with dignity, because you never know the story behind the face in front of you. If you believe in standing up for respect and justice, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change and understanding.